The Berlin Conference in 1884 to 1885 was the pinnacle of European struggle for territory in Africa, sometimes known as the Scramble for Africa. During the 1870s and early 1880s, European nations such as Great Britain, France, and Germany began looking to Africa for natural resources to support their expanding industrial sectors, as well as a potential market for the commodities generated by these industries. As a result, these nations sought to protect their commercial interests in Africa by sending scouts to the continent to negotiate treaties with indigenous peoples or their alleged representatives. Similarly, Belgium's King Leopold II, who wanted to expand his personal riches by acquiring African territory, paid agents to stake claims to enormous areas of land in Central Africa. From then, European merchants began to move into the continent through the sea routes and settled mostly in the coastal areas. The race for land among European powers inevitably resulted in conflict, especially between the Portuguese, Egyptians, and British in East Africa, the French and King Leopold II in Central Africa, and the British and French in West Africa. This sense of rivalry was so intense that it eventually resulted in the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck intervened as a result of the rivalry between France and Great Britain, calling a summit of European powers in Berlin towards the end of 1884. These European colonial powers sought to carve up the African continent, thereby redrawing the map of the continent to suit their ambitions. In the subsequent meetings, Great Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, and Belgium's King Leopold II negotiated their claims to African territories, which were then formalized and mapped. It was a turning point in African history. Without consulting any African leaders, these European powers divided the continent into spheres of influence, claiming territories to avoid conflicts among themselves. During the conference, the leaders also agreed to allow free trade among the colonies and established a framework for negotiating future European claims in Africa. Neither the Berlin Conference itself nor the framework for future negotiations provided any say for the peoples of Africa over the partitioning of their homelands. Delegates were not gathered to talk about issues pertaining to the sovereignty of European powers in Africa or African governments. The absence of Africans from the table was intentional. Their perspectives were deemed superfluous. The efforts of the Sultan of Zanzibar to get himself invited to the party were summarily laughed off by the British. The arbitrary borders drawn by the colonial powers paid little heed to the complex ethnic, cultural, and linguistic diversity of Africa and ignored existing ethnic and cultural boundaries. This has sown the seeds of discord, leading to ongoing conflicts, civil wars, and instability that have plagued many African nations. The forced unification of disparate groups has proven a volatile mix, as communities struggle to coexist under the weight of these colonial legacies. The conference did not initiate European colonization of Africa, but it did legitimate and formalize the process. In addition, it sparked new interest in Africa. Following the close of the conference, European powers expanded their claims in Africa, such that by 1900, European states had claimed nearly 90% of African territory. The colonial powers were not interested in the well-being of Africans, but rather in exploiting the continent's vast natural resources to fuel their industrial growth. This systematic extraction of Africa's wealth, from minerals to timber to agricultural products, has left a legacy of economic disparities and underdevelopment that continues to hinder progress. The colonial economic model was designed to benefit the European powers, not to foster the long-term prosperity of African nations. This legacy has contributed to the persistent challenges of poverty, unemployment, and economic dependence that continue to plague the continent. However, it did something far worse, with ramifications that would ripple through the years and be felt to this day. It created the rules for Africa's invasion and partition, legitimizing the ideas of Africa as a playground for outsiders, its mineral wealth as a resource for the outside world rather than Africans, and its fate as something not to be decided by Africans. Also, the colonial powers focused their infrastructure investments on serving their interests, such as building railways and ports for the export of raw materials. This has left many African countries with woefully inadequate transportation networks, limited access to basic services, and a marked imbalance in development across the continent. The shadows cast by the Berlin Conference have not been easily dispelled. Addressing the complex and deeply rooted issues that stem from this fateful meeting remains a daunting challenge for African nations and the global community. Yet, the resilience and determination of the African people offer hope that the continent can overcome this difficult history and forge a brighter future. The conference set the rules for dividing Africa among European powers, with no African representation. It resolutely refused to consider the question of sovereignty and the legitimacy of laying claim to someone else's land and resources. That's right. Europeans met and decided the rules for dividing up the continent of Africa for themselves. No matter what the indigenous people to the lands thought or wanted, these people believed they had the divine right to do as they pleased. In fact, this is what has led to the boundaries we see today of the 54 African nations and the lack of control on the continent for Africans. At the time of the conference, 80% of Africa remained under traditional and local control. The Europeans only had influence on the coast. Following that, they began taking portions of land inland, eventually resulting in a jumble of geometric boundaries placed on indigenous cultures and regions of Africa. To have their claims to African land validated, European governments had to show that they could genuinely administer the area. Often, military triumph was the easiest part. To rule, they discovered that they had to deal with a complicated environment of shifting identities, cultures, and languages. Thus, the Europeans began reorganizing Africans into units that they could understand and manage. As noted, the colonial period was characterized by the systematic fabrication of African traditions such as ethnicity, customary law, and traditional religion. Before colonization, Africa was known for its plurality, flexibility, and numerous identities. After colonialism, all that seemed to have been changed, and generations were all bound by the rigidities of manufactured tradition. Finally, the African countries were divided as follows: Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, French Equatorial Africa, and Madagascar were awarded to France. Libya, Italy received Eritrea and Somaliland, Belgium received Tanganyika and the Congo, and Portugal received Angola, Zambezi, and a portion of Madagascar. Great Britain took the Gold Coast, now Ghana, Sierra Leone, the Gambia, Nigeria, Sudan, Egypt, Uganda, and South Africa. Spain, as a prominent colonial imperialist, also took some African territory. Despite obtaining independence for the most part in the 1950s and 1960s, many African countries have remained on the catastrophic road set by Berlin. Former Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere declared, "We have artificial nations carved out at the Berlin Conference in 1884, and today we are struggling to build these nations into stable units of human society. We are in danger of becoming the most balkanized continent of the world." Now, 135 years after Berlin, it is perhaps time for introspection. While it is impossible to turn back the clock, Africans should reflect on what has happened since. Teaching the true history of the continent's subjection would assist to dispel myths about ancient hatreds that are supposed to feed the continent's conflict. Thank you for joining us. See you in our next episode.